Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, or good afternoon, and welcome to another episode of Education Matters with Jim O'Connell. I'm very pleased you've taken a moment to join us. We're here on, if you're watching live, it's Tuesday evening, September the 5th, first day of school, and hopefully we're heading into another exciting school year. We are, of course, as we've discussed a little in recent weeks, we're heading into an election here in the city of Manchester. Every 2 years we have an election for school board, board mayor and alderman. The first election will be on September 19th, which is a primary, and that's for those only for those wards. Well, the mayor election has a primary, so there will be an election in every ward. But then, depending on the number of candidates, for instance, if a ward only has 2 candidates for school board, then it wouldn't have a primary for school board. But if it had, as in, for instance, Ward 2 has got 5 candidates for board of mayor and alderman, so those 5 candidates, the public, the electorate gets to choose between those 5, and the top 2 candidates go forward to the November 7th election. So with that, I'm delighted to have with me tonight a guest who is a candidate here in the city of Manchester. He's a candidate for alderman for Ward 2, and I'd like to welcome Will Stewart. Hi, Will. How are you?
Doing well. How are you, Jim?
I'm excellent, thanks. Thanks for joining me tonight. I appreciate it.
Of course. Thank you for the invitation.
I have to say this, that I did send out an invitation to join me on this show to all candidates who were sitting candidates on the school board, and then I made a less vigorous attempt to contact the candidates who are running, who are not currently sitting incumbents. And so, but I have mentioned it on the show here, and I'd like to say it again now, that anybody who's running for office in the city of Manchester, from mayor down through whatever other position, if they'd like to have an opportunity to come before the public, and especially if it has to do with education, but we're here to cover the whole city. So please feel free to contact me, and I'd be happy to schedule you in between now and the 19th of September if possible, or certainly between now and November 7th. So, Will, with that, let's start with, I'm sure many people in the city know you, but for the few that don't, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure, be happy to. And again, thank you for having me on. And I think today is a particularly good day to be on, the first day of school here in Manchester. And I have a son, a 6-year-old, who just started first grade today over at Smith Road School.
It's
and
exciting.
It is. It is. He's very excited, and spoke to him right before I came on, and he had a ball. And I'm just hoping this love of school continues on through the rest of his career. I'm sure it will.
I hope so.
But he's actually, by way of kind of introducing myself and why I'm running for alderman in Ward 2, I think that's a pretty good introduction, because it's really having a child in the public school system here in the city, gives you a lot of skin in the game, with regard to how the city turns out in the next 10, 15, 20 years. And that was really kind of the impetus for me wanting to throw my hat into the ring. I've been active here in the city in a number of varieties and measures for a number of years, both professional and on the community volunteer leadership stage. But this really is my first run for elected office, and I kind of say, and maybe it's becoming a little bit cliche now, that I want Manchester to be a city that people move to and not from. And I certainly hear, I don't know if you hear it, I hear it in my set anyway, that people say, well, we have kids now, so time to move to Bedford or Hooksett or Londonderry or Wyndham, or one of those suburban towns. And that bothers me a little bit. Again, not to say we don't have our challenges, both real and perceived, as it regards education and public safety, but we have a lot going for us too. And I certainly think we have a lot of potential that just is untapped. And so I want to I think given my background, which kind of spans journalism to community organizing to economic development, and now I'm just today started a new job myself as the executive director of a group called Stay Work Play New Hampshire.
Okay. So just on that note, because I noticed that you'd previously been involved with the Hippo, and then you were involved with the Manchester Chamber of Commerce as Director of Economic Development or some of that office, I think.
Yeah, I was there. Yeah, Vice President of Economic Development.
And then on to Derry London Derry Chamber of Commerce most recently, and now starting today, Stay Work Play. So I'm interested to hear your insights about how businesses might view Manchester and what might be done immediately, or sort of the low-hanging fruit for business in Manchester, and then sort of the longer term, where things might be changed.
Sure. So I think this is both a short and long-term objective, but I think what really needs to happen is Manchester has a perception problem, and I think that we don't do a very good job as a city of telling our own story and framing our own message. We let our story be dictated by the headlines in the Union Leader and whatever is the headline story on WMUR every night.
Right.
And oftentimes, as you mentioned, I used to write for the Hippo and other newspapers. And I can tell you, it's the old saying is true: if it bleeds, it leads. It's
Right.
News almost by definition is bad news, and I get it. That's part of what it is. At the same time, we need to do a better job of countering that. Otherwise, people have the perception, as I think many people do, both inside and outside of the city, that Manchester is a city where I think the two dominant takeaways for most people are bad schools and lots of crime.
Right.
And again, not to say we don't have issues. We
Right.
certainly do. We're a city. We're a small city,
Mm-hmm.
but we're a city nonetheless, and we're going to have city issues, and they need to be addressed. But that said, we need to change the narrative. And I think from an economic development, from a business recruitment and retention standpoint, and perhaps more importantly, from a workforce recruitment and retention standpoint, we need to start changing that narrative. It's one of the things, one of the reasons I wrote a book late last year called An Insider's Guide to Manchester. A guidebook for the city. I did a successful Kickstarter for just my own small way of trying to just change that story a little bit and kind of accentuate all of the positive things that we have going on here.
And there are so many, and I'm constantly on the horns of this dilemma, which is because I choose to spend a lot of my time, as in the name of this program even, concentrating on school issues. But in order to, the dilemma for me is this issue of recognizing many of the good things that go on in Manchester and in our schools, and all the wonderful things one could talk about in our schools, but I find myself it's like forced into a position that is not native to me to point out the shortcomings and where the shortcomings are, and it feels horrible almost to me, because it's not. I would much prefer to be the cheerleader of Manchester and the cheerleader of our schools. But if I were to do that, then I would join the vast majority of people, already elected officials in the city of Manchester, who it suits very nicely to not recognise the fact that we have the largest class sizes in the state, that we've got the least well-funded in terms of per capita expenditure in the state, and that despite the fact of having the largest class sizes in the state, and on June 1st of 2017, we're coming back to school on September 5th, and somewhere between 11 and 14 teachers less than we had when we so I spent some time today on the phone with a school board member who's a very nice person, and we had maybe it was yesterday actually, I apologize, and we spoke at length, but that person was unaware that we had actually that the net was a net loss of teachers, and now they know, of course. But that is our challenge. Let me say, for those of you watching in, if you're watching live on Tuesday, the phone-in number is 640-3091, and it should be on the screen as you watch as well. So 640-3091. We'll welcome your input and any questions that you might have. Will, talk to me about Stay Work Play. What is that?
So it's a statewide nonprofit organization that was founded back in 2009 with the goal of attracting and retaining 20 and 30 somethings here to New Hampshire. kind of recognizing that, as you may have heard, we're in a bit of a demographic crunch
Yes.
here in the state and across New England and northern New England in particular, where I think New Hampshire, we usually vie with Maine, Vermont, and Florida as being the oldest state on average, and that has some challenges
Right.
moving forward, and not the least among them is our businesses aren't going to have a workforce.
Right.
The workforce that they need, not just to survive, but to expand and to grow, unless we're able to both retain and attract, more new blood to the state.
And then, so in order to retain, and I think in terms of education, I think about students who are graduating. I happen to have 2 students in university right now. Two of my kids, and then I have a third who's a senior in high school who will be graduating this year. So I'll have 3, God willing, in university next year, and I don't want to speak for all of them. It's not like they have one mind and they all feel the same. But generally speaking, just broad picture, they and most of their friends, or many of their friends, let's not say most, because I don't know that to be very precise in language here. The majority view, unscientifically gotten, for me, is that most of them intend on departing the state either for education or I have one kid in state at UNH and one out of state at Syracuse. But in any case, they and their friends, it seems to me their intention is to leave New Hampshire once they graduate, and that's a very sad state of affairs. So what do you think? I know it's, we've got a lot of people. We've got a federal government, we've got federal agencies, we've got a state government, a governor, state agencies. There's a long way down the feeding pole or feeding chain until we get to mayor and then alderman in the city of Manchester. So recognizing all the limitations of what one alderman can do, but from a vision point of view, what we recognize we have this problem with demographics and with retaining people. What are a couple of things that you think are attainable in the first or second term for you, or things you will drive towards?
Well, and you're right. It's difficult for one person to do much by him or herself. So it will all depend on who else the voters elect.
Right.
Come this November, both in the corner office at City Hall and the alderman.
Mm-hmm.
That said, I think there are things. I'll preface my answer by saying this: that economic development these days is less about, as it used to be, about attracting individual companies. We're used to kind of go out and go fishing and try to land one from out of state and reel them in.
Mm-hmm.
These days it's more about attracting workforce. The businesses will go where the workforce is. So that's kind of sets the stage and why this is so important. And I think that first Manchester has to use the word vision. And I think that is the biggest challenge that the city faces. I think a lot of the other challenges that we have are symptoms of a lack of vision. Be they in schools and public safety or other things. So I think first and foremost we need to have a vision of what we want the city to be. Kind of who do we want to be when we grow up? I don't think Manchester's done a very good job of answering that question. We seem to be very reactive instead of proactive.
Right.
And I think that once we can figure out what that vision is and get buy-in, then it becomes a little bit easier to figure out what specifically to do. I think that there are any number of things, but we really have to figure out who do we want. We can't be all things to all people. So we have to figure out. I think my personal analysis, as we mentioned, Manchester is a small city. So I think there are some, perhaps from smaller towns who want a larger city experience, but might not want Boston or New York. And there might be some in Boston and New York, who want a city experience, but not a tiny town.
Right.
So being able to kind of maybe cater to that demographic, and what we're already seeing, down in the Mill Yard in particular, it's really becoming acute. Not just with companies like Dine and Oracle, which have been screaming for workers for years now, but of course with Dean Kamen's Army initiative, is that, and I've talked when I was at both of my chamber roles, talking to business owners, managers, HR directors, they're saying they're not just having to sell their particular company. I've talked to folks not just in the tech industry but across the board who say, look, we can offer the same wages as you can get in Boston, but it's still a challenge, because right. Boston sometimes sells itself, but we have to sell Manchester, and I think that it's sometimes it's both things big and small.
Right.
So it's things like schools, like public safety, but it's also little quality of life things like sidewalks. And one of the things I've been involved with, bicycle advocacy here in Manchester.
Right.
And you may have seen the new bike share program that we have, stations downtown, the Mill Yard,
yep.
at the back room.
How's that going?
Very well.
Yeah.
Very well. We have more than 300 registered users so far, just launched in June.
Nice.
So I think that that kind of speaks, though. It's a pretty good example of, that's the kind of thing where people initially said, that'll never work in Manchester.
Right.
Yeah, we're not that kind of town. But we are that kind of town.
Yep.
And people have just been waiting for it. And I think, whether it's something like that, which was, Bike Manchester, the local nonprofit did all on our own, or maybe bigger projects like a Riverwalk. People want, these kinds of amenities.
Right. Yeah. On the bicycle initiative, besides the bicycle initiative, which is the rent a bike or whatever that bike share thing, what about bike paths? That area. I know you've been involved with, I don't know what an organisation or an association, Bike Manchester or something like that.
Correct, yeah. Bike Manchester is the name of the organization, which has been in existence since late 2013, so almost 4 years now. And you're right, in that time, the city has seen its first bike lanes, on city streets, kind of here and there. But we're working with the Department of Public Works, and now they kind of have a policy where if they're resurfacing streets and if there's sufficient width, they'll stripe a lane, or what are called sharrows. You may have seen the markings on Chestnut Street. They just put them on Elm Street, north of Bridge. Those kind of symbols with the bicycle and the arrows, indicating to motorists and bicyclists to share. And bike paths as well. We've been able, there are couple of paths right now that have grant funding that are, soon to be, expanded and paved.
Yeah. The South Manchester one, is it South Manchester through to East Manchester, sort of? I've seen some, and then of course the opening of the Singer Bridge into Goffstown last year, the year before, was a big addition.
Right, the hands across the Merrimack Bridge first, and then the bridge across into Goffstown, proper.
Yeah. So
huge.
They are huge. I have to tell you. So with the, I've got so many things. I made a couple of scribbled notes here, and but anyway. But one of the things with the repaving of Elm Street, I'm surprised that no effort was made to do any traffic calming measures. I mean, I think it was, in my view, to repave the street, sort of to give us another 10 years of that which we've had before. Elm Street was transformed 20 years ago or so when it went from 4 lanes of traffic down to 2. And that made a big difference, and businesses started coming back, and it was a walkable place. But, it seemed to me to cry. I look at what has been done in when I think about Manchester, I often think about 2 cities in particular, Burlington, Vermont, and Portland, Maine. And I think we've done some things, and it's not as though they've done everything perfectly well, and we haven't. But there are lessons we can learn from them, and I'm sure the reciprocal is true also. But it seems to me, I was surprised that there weren't, for instance, designated colours like a green colour crossings or green coloured bike lanes, etc. I would have liked something much more expansive, like islands down through the middle of the street that were tree lined, and that we created spaces where perhaps eventually one could pedestrianize Elm Street for periods of time on a Sunday or whatever periods might be agreed. But how do you feel about doing something with Elm Street in the long term to make it more user-friendly?
Right, more user-friendly and more inviting.
Yes.
I'm a proponent of a concept called complete streets. And this is making streets that are compatible and complete and inviting for everyone. Motorists, yes, but also bicyclists, pedestrians, seniors, folks with mobility issues. And I think, kind of those traffic calming measures and, islands and, things like that are certainly, it's a shame more wasn't done,
right.
this time around.
I think it is.
But things like you mentioned, like paint, on the, doing different colors for the bike lanes or crosswalks. Paint's pretty cheap. We can do paint,
right.
Without tearing up the whole street. And one of the things I'm hoping is that maybe a lesson will be learned, with regard to Canal Street. As you know, I wasn't around at the time, but I talked to former Mayor Syl Dupuy, and he likes to tell the story of one of his biggest regrets was filling in the canals on what's now Canal Street. Used to be a canal. He said they really didn't have a choice at the time. People were dumping cars, and it was just a kind of a really unfortunate situation.
Right.
But I think that's an opportunity where that's basically, it might as well be a freeway. I mean, it's a 4-lane, one direction, each way, and it really does separate, downtown from the Mill Yard. And I know the group Manchester Connects is, doing a lot of work to try and reconnect those two, kind of vibrant neighborhoods to make them more pedestrian friendly and, to allow, movement of people more easily. I think there's a lot of opportunity there. Perhaps you're right with the, the trees down the middle, more of a boulevard, aspect.
Yeah, I mean, there's one of the things that I think there is a problem in Manchester with, and something that needs to be changed, which is the acquiescence to mediocrity, an acceptance that it's never voiced, but an acceptance that our best days are behind us, that anything we might attempt to do now is too expensive and can't really be done, so let's not do it. One of the places that I would suggest you look, among the many, but I don't know what the budget was this current year, but last year, and I've mocked this, and I don't mean to be a mocking person, but this is it's hard not to, when someone puts the ball right over the plate, it's very hard not to take a swipe at it. But the City of Manchester, the year before last, the budget for promoting the City of Manchester was $10,000. And I've mocked it in that I know restaurant and pizza shop owners in Manchester who spend more than that in a month on advertising their premises. And we have the City of Manchester, the largest urban area north of Boston, and we're spending 10. You can't compete in the world where you've decided to counter the misinformation. We talk about there's a perception, there's a reality situation for Manchester that needs to be addressed head on. Chief Willard works at it every day, and the superintendent of schools, is working on it every day, and sometimes with the resources they need, often without the resources they need. But there are two sides to this. There's the perception and the reality. And we're doing nothing on the perception side, or at least very little. We have organizations that do it, but it's not in a coordinated way. So I give us very poor marks for the efforts we make in promoting the City of Manchester. Now, it's very possible that the Manchester Chamber of Commerce is representing Manchester at conferences all around the country every year and doing, but if they are, it's not visible to the general public. You won't find it by Googling it. So for me, having a vision, agreeing a vision, and not turning it into a 21-person committee that meets over 2 years, but rather, recognizing that which we have and moving forward. I would like to see that change. I think we should have a profession. We are, a city is almost like a corporation. Let's represent. Let's create an image, a vision, and then sell that. And we wouldn't, in any sense, be selling, selling something, trying to sell against the trend, so to speak. I think you rightfully state there are so many great things in the city that we could be doing. Let me ask you. I have another question for you, and actually, I guess I'm putting something out there, and you can respond to it. My observation when it comes to economic development in the city of Manchester is that. My first one is about this mediocrity thing, that sort of we don't have enough faith in ourselves, and we don't realize the full amount of that which we have, and the value and the value of it. But the other thing is that I think we've gotten caught up on this we're not Massachusetts thing. And that's putting it nicely, because I think you can make a statement about we're not Massachusetts and make it a very positive statement, as opposed to like the New Hampshire Advantage. I'm not a big fan of the New Hampshire Advantage thinking, because the New Hampshire Advantage may have existed before, but it doesn't. It's proving itself not to be worthy today, or not to be worthwhile today. It's a bit like if you were a town outside of London, England. And rather than rather than taking everything that London has and getting the best of it and taking a piece of it and basking in its reflected glory, to overdo the we're nothing like London thing is a problem. So in Manchester we have such a vibrant community to our south. There are people who, you rightfully said earlier, there are people who will people like GE who are coming into Boston and bringing huge numbers of employees there. And some people coming up from Connecticut will not want to live in Boston, and would easily look at a city like Manchester. Not if it's saying, oh, we purport to be some sort of backwater, but rather, we're an alternative style of living. So I think I would love to see sort of an embrace of of the fact that we are within the orbit of Boston, and buying into the greater Boston thing and saying, look, but you can have proximity to Boston, but you can look at the quality of life you can have here in Manchester without spending the kind of money you have to spend to be in Boston.
And that's one of our biggest advantages. I know, people say it over and over again, but that's because it's true, is that, Manchester is an hour from everywhere. We're an hour from Boston. We're an hour from the seacoast. We're an hour from the mountains. We're an hour from the lakes.
Right.
It's location, location, location. That is everything, and it's great.
Sadly, of course, and we could be 30 minutes from Boston if we had high-speed rail. So, our current
and that's
mayor,
45 minutes on a really good day, probably really 2 a.m. or something.
But, there's very few times. I go to Boston all the time, and I've made a great habit of going to Boston, and my kids grew up we went to Boston all the time. We just, it was something we did, and so they feel as though they're not just Manchester natives, but they're sort of, they feel at home in the city of Boston, and so, and it is a great city, But yeah, it's very hard to get to Boston in under an hour anytime, but an hour is probably a good generalization. It's not true. My daughter worked for a company as an intern for a company in Burlington all summer, and so she was an hour and a half or more going to work every morning and an hour and a half coming home. So she spent 8 hours at work and 3 to 4 hours driving for the summer. But there wasn't any public transportation alternative to get to Burlington, for instance. One of the things I learned through that process was I was amazed that the Regional Transportation Centre in Woburn, which is the main train and bus station north of Boston, there is no connection between the buses from Manchester down don't stop in Woburn, and Woburn's the gateway to Burlington and 128 and all the rest of it. So it just gave me an insight into how limited public transportation is when you can't get to the major or suburban regional transportation link from Manchester downtown and from exit 5. The buses don't stop there, and that may be a chicken or an egg thing. But back to our current mayor has said obviously he doesn't favour rail, and I'm sure many of his most ardent supporters and the people he likes to speak on behalf of probably don't either, so he's reflecting them. But he is a little less than forthright on this topic, because he says, I'm all for rail, I just want to know who's going to pay for it. So basically, it's as good as saying I'm never going to do it, because he doesn't favour any public expenditure, if I'm not putting words in his mouth. So he's looking for how is this thing going to pay for itself and who's going to pay for it. And so long as it's ever going to require subvention, then he won't support it. Of course, if you live in the real world, we all recognise that the interstate system has huge subsidies spent on it every year. And if you took that same attitude to I-93, then you'd either knock it down, or you would never have built it in the first place. Because if you ask the question, I'd love a highway from Manchester to Boston, but who's going to pay for it, then you never would have built it. So the argument just doesn't hold. What's your attitude? I don't know if I'm sort of throwing soft ones at you or something, but just to have it on record, what's your attitude to high-speed rail?
So I'm in favor of transportation options. I think the word options is what it comes down to, and I think everybody likes options, right?
Right.
You don't like being confined, and that's in much of Manchester and much of New Hampshire. If you don't have a car, you're out of luck, to a certain extent. I'm one of my volunteer activities, I'm a Manchester Transit Authority Commissioner, and so I'm a big proponent of public transit, and of course I do the bicycle stuff, so I'm a big transportation guy. So I'm in favor of rail. I'm in favor of expanded buses. I'm in favor of better pedestrian access, better sidewalks, because I'm speaking of something that doesn't pay for itself. But I guarantee you it makes all the properties where there are sidewalks more valuable. And the businesses down on Elm Street, they wouldn't be nearly as valuable, and those properties wouldn't be nearly as valuable if they didn't have sidewalks out front, just as an example. So, I'm all about, giving people options. And you're right, a transportation network is only as good as the size of the network and the connections that you can make. So the more connections that we can make, we can't isolate ourselves from the rest of the world. Our strength is our connections, and that's what we need to be making more of.
Right. A couple of things happened recently that if we're not spinning off into, let's just spend the 1 minute on it. We'll get back to local politics. But there's a transfer. I believe there's a transformation coming in transportation, and a couple of factoids. From recently, the CEO of Intel was on CNBC, that business show on television, some weeks ago, and he said that he was certain that his grandchildren would never learn to drive, that they were going to be in driverless cars. And he was certain of that. That wasn't he thought it might happen, but he was sure of it. And then we had the British government announcement from 3 or 4 weeks ago where cars with an internal combustion engine would no longer be sold after 2040, and that those that existed would be eliminated off the streets by 2053. So if you look at the growth of driverless cars, the growth of shared like Lyft and Uber, and the growth of biking, etc., there was a time that we all knew about people who lived in Manhattan or who lived in the Back Bay of Boston who chose not to own cars. And that population has grown and grown and grown because of the availability of multiple transport methods, choices, like you said. And it seems that in the city of Manchester, from a planning point of view, we need to get ahead of the curve on this. So there's a real job of work to be done with the planning department around what the future of the city will look like. And now we're deep into urban planning, but the issue of allowing residences to be created above stores on, using second, third floors, the perhaps insistence of multi-story rather than single-story buildings in some places where I believe because of the things I just mentioned that the requirements for parking for these properties are all out of whack. It has a big effect on our environment, both our visual environment and our environment in terms of rainwater, wastewater runoff, and all those other things, because we're paving areas that in 40 years from now it's very likely that the requirements of a Rite Aid, number of parking spaces based on number of shoppers, will be a fraction of what it is today.
Right, and we see what happens when you overpave and like what's going on in Houston. I mean, there's obviously differences between Manchester and Houston,
right.
But that's one of those issues.
We can do that. Let's go back to, since we're in the school, and again, let me remind anybody who's out there that it's the calling number is 640-3091, and as you can see, the conversation is pretty wide ranging. So don't be shy to there are so many subjects in Manchester. I think we'll go back to probably the two key things. I think you mentioned them, and I agree with you. That the two key things for Manchester are, you called it crime. I think the perception of crime over the reality of crime, there's an issue there. Statistically, we're better off than we sometimes think we are. But the opiate crisis is really a subset of crime, but it's a separate worth separate. We should spend a moment on that. And then I'd like to go to education. But let's talk about the opiate crisis for a minute. Again, recognizing this multi-layered cake thing and how the pyramid flows down, and as one alderman or even as a board, that this is a national problem, it's a regional problem, and so it requires lots of moving parts. But what's your take on what Manchester might continue to do, or do better, or cease doing with regard to the opiate crisis?
Well, I think we're starting from a good spot, and that I haven't heard anybody say it's not a problem.
Yes.
So we're admitting as a city,
First
step in AA, you admit you have a problem, and we do. And I think there are no easy solutions. If there were, we would have figured it out. Some other city elsewhere would have figured it out. So I think what we do is try everything we can. I think you hear about the safe stations with the fire department. Definitely seems to be a success. I know the panhandling signs, which the chief is a proponent of. I don't know if signs will solve everything, but it's something. We have to try something, and this is something that the likes of which we just haven't seen before, and so it's new to everybody. And I can't blame anybody for not having the answer for everything, but I think we have to. I'm a proponent of data-driven decision making. So we can't just say, well, I think my gut tells me this will work. Let's look at what is working elsewhere,
Right.
recognizing that there's no need to reinvent the wheel if cities elsewhere are doing things. Right. That said, on the other hand, we can't be afraid to try things and to experiment with some innovative solutions too.
Yeah, my observation is a little harsh, I guess, and I'll have to go and re-examine myself someday, and I might find out I'm not the person I think I am really, because I'm going from harsh to harsh.
Getting really existential here, Jim.
Yeah, I am. I'll have to have moments of deep introspection and see what the heck is going on. But when I look at the state of New Hampshire's response to the opiate problem, I see it as wholly inadequate and largely ineffective. And I don't deny at all that lots of people are doing their very best, and I see individual aldermen, the board in general, the mayor, trying very hard. I think it's obvious from listening to the mayor. I think it's something that Mayor Gatz is heartfelt about. At least I get he's doing a wonderful con job if he's not, because I believe him when I hear him speak that he is deeply affected when parents call him and talk to him, and it's something that he would like to do something about. So it isn't coming from there that I want to sort of, damn people, but it has to do with our form of government and the way in which we view things. So to me, the safe station thing is a wonderful innovation. It allows you to use existing infrastructure, but all it actually has done really is open the door, a physical door, and said, look, there's a physical spot that was already in existence. Why don't you go there and we'll talk to the fire department, or the fire department has proposed that they will accept people, they'll bring them to the whatever place they can bring them to. So we've overplayed that. I think that's a very simple, that's a tiny functional step that we didn't put any resources behind it. I heard some money that, because of some overtime and some other, there might be some 30,000 here or 20,000 there. But, we have an issue where we have hundreds and hundreds of people dying in our state. And the dying piece is just a part of the bigger, the effect it's having on families and children and across our, And while this is going on, we haven't ever, what we're not doing is we haven't seen a new Elliott Hospital open up, or something with 1,000 beds in it in Hillsborough County. We haven't seen, 100 psychiatrists, whatever the group of people might be, who would deal with these things, mental health, opiate abuse, drug abuse specialists, etc. There aren't shining trucks driving up and down Elm Street with the new drug, the drug rehabilitation unit fully financed from the federal government down. So there's been no response from the federal government to this issue at all. Mm-hmm. And that's damning of the federal government. And you can start with President Trump, but he's just one guy with one pen. There's hundreds of others sitting on Capitol Hill with lots of pens. They could all do something. So I think it's woeful. I think it's a terrible response to what is a national problem. And then when I look at the state of New Hampshire, and we couldn't even get Hillsborough County to take money that they had in their savings, so to speak, to open a drug court in Hillsborough County. And we already know that we look at Sullivan County, the one county in the state where they have a drug rehabilitation or drug courts where the recidivism rate is down to 20%. So they are actually managing to take 8 out of every 10 people. Yeah, 4 of every 5 people. The math's coming back.
This is Education Matters.
There you go. It is. So so there are solutions. So mm-hmm. I would like to see. I think the real job, if I could be so bold as to offer my advice,
please.
The main, I think doing the things we try to do, safe stations, the various charities that we can enable with grants of $10,000 and $20,000 and $30,000. Those are feeble answers, though. I mean, they need to be there, and they're good. And thank you to those who are doing it. But these are feeble responses to what is a national problem and a huge problem in the state of New Hampshire. The state of New Hampshire should buck up, wake up, and actually take real action to fix this. We have a mental health programs in this state that are woefully underfunded, under-resourced. We've got, disastrous levels of staffing in both YDC and in our mental health. And we get all excited in the state of New Hampshire with a population of 1.5 million when we add 10 new beds after 20 years of downsizing. So I'm sorry I'm so harsh on this, but to me, the response to the opioid crisis has been we're playing around the edges, because what we won't do is actually take real action to kind of stamp it out. And if you're going to do this, then I would would suggest to go, right, Jim's going to stop pontificating now and allow the actual guy who decided to run, and thank you for running, to say something. Opiate crisis. So the other thing, schools. Let's talk about schools since we're on Education Matters. And I'm going to try and shut up now a little bit because people are tired of listening to me, the few who are still listening. So education, obviously, it's great. It's wonderful. I commend you for having your son in the public school system. Many of our public representatives don't take that step. So I think that's an important. That would give you a big plus in my view when I look at candidates. What else about education? Recognizing that you're an alderman, that you will have final, decision on the financing, but in the end you're an alderman, not a school board member. But would you like to address what you see as the issues in education in Manchester and what might be done?
Sure, and there are, as we discussed, challenges both real and perceived. I think, some of them are structural, some of them are funding related, some of them are policy related. I think one of the biggest kind of structural challenges is that the aldermen, of course, approve the budget for the school district, but they have no say in how the money is spent. The school board decides how the money is spent, but they have no say in how much money they get. So that both sides, when things don't happen, they can both kind of point to each other and say it's that guy's fault. So that's a challenge, and that's kind of the way things are.
Would you like to see that change, and if so, how?
I don't know. It's I don't have a better solution. I've heard some people say, well, we should give the school board taxing authority like they have in Concord. That's one option. Other people say, well, we should just return the school department to being, or the school district to being a department of the city, as it used to be. I would want to have more conversations like this with experts like yourself to really understand the ramifications.
Folks. Remember, I'm an expert now. Thank you, Will. No, but
you have a show called Education
Matters.
Jim,
I do,
so.
and yes. So, and I have spent some time looking at this, and I'm like you. I worry about if you were to make the school board its own taxing authority. That the problem that we see with a small number of people who can be sort of Luddite in their views towards education, which, we're not going to spend a dime regardless of what the needs and requirements are. And that's being a little cruel to them, but the ones who their first response is, I'm going to hold the line, I'm not going to spend any more money, and now I'm going to find the solution within that now all we'd have is a lower barrier to entry for people to get elected onto that board, and then you'd have the barrier there. Or I think from my friends who would like to hold the line and say, we don't need any more, they should also be a little nervous about the fact that, the barrier to entry for a school board is a little lower than it is for aldermen, and so therefore it might be easier for a bunch of spendthrift, liberal lunatics, as they might call them, to come on the board and spend money willy-nilly. So I worry about that.
It's a double-edged sword.
It is for sure. I do believe this, and this is not based on. I think it's aggravated by the current mayor and his attitude towards things. He's sort of my way or the highway way of dealing with things, in my view. I think that having the mayor of the city chairman of both boards is a problem. So I think that if I were to offer a solution, I think that having the school board chaired by a separate chairman, somebody elected from within the body of 14. That would choose amongst themselves to be a chairperson for the period of 2 years. And at that point, we would now have, for the first time, we would have a political voice in the city arguing for education. Because what we have today is we have a mayor, and I don't just mean Mayor Gatsis, but the role of the mayor is such that he can never just argue on behalf of the schools on their own, because he has to deal with the realpolitik of all the other issues that need to be resolved. So sure. That's something that I'd like to see. Let me segue from there into choice for mayor. I'm going to put you on the hot seat. Have you chosen a candidate that you support, and if so, who is it, and if so, why?
Well, I'll say first of all that I'm running for alderman,
right.
Not running for mayor. That said, my vision, I would say, more closely aligns with Joyce Craig's than Mayor Gatsis's.
Okay. If Mayor Gatsis were to be successful, how is your relationship with him, or how would you expect your relationship with him to be?
I've known him, for a number of years. back from when I was, I think, at NeighborWorks. I knew him certainly at the Manchester Chamber. Got to know him and have worked with, with his office and his staff, well over a number of years on bike-related initiatives and such. You may remember he was you may have seen the ribbon cutting of him on a bike, riding around the bike share program.
I remember that. Yeah,
and he's a Ward 2 resident too. He used to be the Ward 2 alderman before he became mayor. So I've told people, who've asked, on the campaign trail when I'm out talking to voters on their doorsteps, I'll work with whoever the voters elect.
Right.
I can't control that. So I respect, the will of the voters. If they return him to office, I'll work with him. If they choose Joyce Craig, I'll work with her. Right. Same thing with all the other aldermen and school board members too.
Very good, very good. I find myself at loggerheads with Mayor Gatzis regularly, just because and school issues. We're sort of. I like to think every now and again there's a coming together somewhat of thoughts. I mean, the primary division that I have with the mayor has to do with the fact that he would like it to be known. Like, I recognize the fact that as a mayor, part of your job is to herald from on high the glories and positive nature of the things that are going on in the city. So,
sure. And
we wouldn't want a mayor who wasn't doing that. Nobody wants a mealy-mouthed, woe is me mayor. So I'm fine with the mayor talking about and blowing up all the good things that are happening in the city. What I'm not fine with is pretending that the bad things aren't there, and by pretending they're not there, taking no action. And so I've been at loggerheads with him around this topic of let's agree that this idea that we should be able to state to the citizens of Manchester that it is embarrassing for us all to have the least well-funded school system in the state. And it's an embarrassment that we've got the highest number of kids in the classrooms of any city in the state. We recognize it, and we're doing things about it. We're going to seek to resolve it, and during my tenure or whatever, I will see it move in the right direction. That would be a much preferable, that's a stance, a mayor that I would expect to be able to have conversations with, that we say, okay, now let's talk. And I support Joyce Craig for mayor. And I'm very realistic about Joyce Craig. I've known Joyce Craig for some time, and I don't expect, there to be some magic moment happens that Joyce Craig gets elected to the corner office, and all of a sudden, all the problems of Manchester are going to be resolved overnight. I mean, I don't believe anything close to that or anything like that. But I do think I go back to this mediocrity and acquiescence to the status quo. And in my case, I look at Mayor Gatzis. I think he's given what he could have given to the city. His commitment to the city is clear, sort of a city guy, and the quintessential politician, good at what he does from a political point of view. Has tried very hard, I think. Nobody could accuse him of laziness or not trying, but I think it's time for a fresh face, and so I support him. Let me ask you another question. I'm sorry we're going from sort of point to point, Will, but I'm aware of time and my ability to stay on one point for an hour if we could. On the healthcare issue for public representative, for our board of school, and for our aldermen. What's your feeling on the healthcare? Should public representatives be offered healthcare by the city, and should it be paid for by the city, et cetera, et cetera? Where do you stand on that?
It's not something I've given a lot of thought to. I'm lucky in that my wife has a great health insurance plan, and I have health insurance through my wife's employment, as does my son. So I'm not in a position where I would quote unquote have to take it.
Right.
I recognize that this is essentially a volunteer position. There's a small stipend, $5,000 a year or something, and that's one of the quote unquote benefits. The other is the ability to buy in to the health insurance standpoint. Ultimately, I think while I don't foresee myself taking the insurance, I think for the amount of time that the people are putting in on behalf of the city. I don't think it's unreasonable to allow them to buy in. Yes, I think public servants, I find this one difficult too.
it's not something I'd given a lot of thought to. And when the numbers that I was given was a number that was, this is what it costs. So it's basically the equivalent of what a monthly subscription would be. But actually, because the city is self-insured, that doesn't represent the amount of money that is being spent on healthcare. So people have told me, and this is where I started to waver, because previously when it was effectively its value is, let's say it's worth $1,200 a month for a family, or $1,500 a month for a family, and $700 or $800 for an individual, whatever the market bears, whatever's being paid right now. And when you add all that up and multiply it by 29, the mayor and the 28, if they all took it, and it's 200,000, 150,000, 130,000. I heard it. I think it was 130,000 was a number I heard at one point. And then it seems to me you get a lot of, why not give that to people? But then I've heard many rumors now that have gone on for a long time, that the truth of the matter is, since the city is self-insured, that because of the requirements of people from time to time on those boards, that the actual bill to the city is vastly higher than the number represented. So the number that's represented is not obviously they don't want it to be user identifiable. So it's just this is what this notional number about this is what the plan is worth, $1,200 a month or something, multiply it out. If you had a person on, say, the board of mayor and aldermen who required a $2 million one tooth extraction, then all of a sudden the bill for last year becomes $2 million plus the 130,000, and so that's where and I would like when you're elected, it's something I think worth looking into, is that if it's a significant issue, if there actually are large amounts of money, if it's worth very large amounts of money, and by that I mean $1 million or something of that nature. $500,000 is 10 teachers in the city of Manchester. If we have 10 teachers less than we need because we're offering healthcare to board members, I don't know where the line is, but that's getting pretty close to it. If we're losing 20 teachers so we can keep people on a school board, then that probably is a cost too much. Anyway, okay, so as time moves on, ladies and gentlemen, again, I don't know if you're all at home munching your dinner or not. It's the call-in number is 640-3091, and you're very welcome to call in. Another topic I think that in the city of Manchester is the whole issue of the river and the boardwalk and that whole thing, which is. You may know, because you're in a further forward seat than the one I'm in on these matters. Is there any action in Manchester around the topic of a boardwalk, riverside development, or something? So, is there something substantial that's being planned or thought of, or are people working on that?
I think talked about and maybe planned at the conceptual level, but not too much tangible, to my knowledge. Right. I'm not in the thick of the discussions of, like I mentioned, the group Manchester Connects, which I think would love to see that. I don't know if you attended their kind of unveiling of their final plan.
I didn't, but I watched it on public television later, and I was intrigued.
Yeah, and it's fascinating ideas, and I know the idea of a river walk has been, I think it's been talked about at least since the 90s, right. from what I've heard about. So again, things like like the opioid crisis, if it were easy to do, it would have been done by now. Right. And I realize there are certain engineering and structural challenges, particularly when some of the mills go right up to the river. Yeah. So you'd have to cantilever out over it, and not to say these are obstacles that can't be overcome, but there are. It's not as simple as you're just putting down a sidewalk or some asphalt right along the river. That said, other cities across the country, across the world, have somehow managed to do these types of things. Mm-hmm. And I think that it's having a river is an asset. I mean, that's the whole reason that Manchester is here, is because of that river. Right. And it's so underutilized. It could be so much more. And yet, we've just kind of essentially ignored it, since the mills have closed and no longer use kind of that hydropower that it was based on. It's
Right.
just kind of sitting there dividing the city when it could be so much more on both sides of the river.
Yeah, yeah. You and I spoke to you briefly once before. No, not briefly, at length once before, which I still remember. And there's a whole, the whole idea that this vision issue for Manchester is very important, because if you suddenly, inherited the money or had a bunch of money, someone found $100 million to spend on a boardwalk and whatever else you might do, a river walk and things. It would be wrong to go about it by sort of building the boardwalk and then deciding what to do with the boardwalk. I think it would be the other way around. It would be part of what's the vision?
Right.
What are you going for? What are you going after? And then build the boardwalk, riverwalk to match that vision.
Correct.
As opposed to the other way around. So,
which gets back to my original point of one of the biggest challenge, in my opinion, facing the city is a lack of vision.
Right.
Because that would, once we have that, then you can decide on, well, if and how do we want to do a river walk? What amenities do we want it to have?
Right.
How do we want it to be designed? Where do we want it to connect to?
Right.
Same thing with schools, with public safety, and so on.
Right. We're down to about 4 minutes left or something like that, Will. Just one thing, and then I'd like you to just say anything that you'd like to say that you think hasn't been covered. But you mentioned your wife, your son. You have one child?
I do, yes.
Okay, and your wife, so it's you and your wife and your son who's now going to Smith Road.
Correct.
And where did you how long have you been in Manchester, and where do you originate from?
Sure. So my wife and I, she was my fiance at the time. We moved up in 2004 from Tennessee.
Oh, nice.
And, was in journalism at the time, as I mentioned. Moved up to take a job at the
Right.
Hippo, and that's a job I was at for a little less than 2 years. And so the reason we moved up sight unseen, and we're just kind of fascinated with Manchester, and we like to call this the hometown that we chose.
Nice.
And it really is. We could have picked up and gone. Once that job was over, we could have gone anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
But we didn't. We stayed here, and we made a life and a family here. This is where we chose to make our biggest investment of our lives, our home on Blodgett Street. It's where we chose to start our family. It's where we chose to send our kid in the local public schools. So
Mm-hmm.
it really is the hometown we chose, and we love it. And again, I think it's a city of best kept secrets, and that's one of the reasons I've I like to think everything that I've done in my professional life, journalism, community organizing, economic development through the chamber, and now Stay Work Play, have all been a way of giving back in a professional capacity. Likewise, I've done so in a volunteer capacity. I'm the captain of the Oak Park Neighborhood Watch.
Mm-hmm.
I'm on the Friends of Pretty Park Board of Directors, both Ward 2 organizations.
Where wonderful work has gone on in the last few weeks alone.
A beautiful restoration.
It's absolutely beautiful. I advise people to go and look at Wagner Park. I never know what to call it, Wagner Park or Wagner Park, but
yeah, the official name is Wagner Memorial Park.
Wagner
but I
Memorial.
call it that, and everybody just looks at me. They just kind of stares at me. I
Yeah,
say
it's
Pretty Park.
and
Ah,
like
yes,
that.
Pretty
Yeah.
Park.
And it is now Pretty Park. And,
It certainly is.
And not yet complete, of course.
Correct. Yeah, about 2/3 of it has been done. So I've been able to give back in a number of capacities. I also mentioned the Bike Manchester, which I'm a part of. So this is my first run for elected office, but I think I have a kind of a unique skill set and perspective that I think would be valuable.
Well, we've managed to cover an hour here. I appreciate you coming in at the time you've given today. I hope the folks at home who are watching and who will watch this over the coming week have gotten to know you a little bit better. And I'm very excited by the prospect of you being on the board of Mayor and Alderman. And good luck.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Good night, folks, and thanks for being with us. We'll see you again next week. Good night from Jim O'Connell and Will Stewart.